Good. Well, I'm delighted to launch the afternoon session, which I shall be chairing. I'm looking forward enormously to the 3 talks that we have scheduled, and I'm sure that we shall all enjoy them immensely. So it's a valid question, how much do small projects that we fund, that we've described by ABC, contribute to bird conservation in Africa? Well, we have no better person to answer that question than our own Conservation Officer, Chris Magin, and I'll be asking him to step up in a moment. Chris is a Cambridge graduate who completed his PhD on hyraxes in the wonderful Serengeti National Park of northern Tanzania. He's described as having a long and varied career. For the last 12 years, he's worked in the partner development unit of the RSPB and now heads up the team working in Africa and Asia. His own current work focuses on working with partner organizations in Kenya and Tanzania, and he previously worked for BirdLife International in Morocco and has also lived in an interesting range of countries which are enumerated as Djibouti, Niger, and Kenya. But happily, he is today in London, and he's going to tell us about Every Little Helps, how small projects contribute to African bird conservation. Chris. Yeah, I'll just get rid of that. So that's your presentation, isn't it? Yeah. And so you just get full screen, and then if you just use that, you can either use the pointer forward and back there, and that button here is the laser.
Okay, thanks. Well, thank you very much, Richard, and good afternoon, everybody. So many of you have the misfortune to know me already, but as those who don't, Richard's already given a little introduction. I've actually also been involved with the African Bird Club as a volunteer since around 2006, and have been on the ABC Council as a conservation officer, responsible for collating and reviewing conservation award applications since 2010. So as Richard mentioned, I've been in and out of Africa since 1979, working and living in various countries. I like to think that I look younger than I am, but when I told Colin Beale earlier that I'd done my PhD in 84 and 85 in the Serengeti, he said, "Oh, I thought you did it much earlier than that." So thank you, Colin. So I'm just going to highlight some of the many diverse projects that the Conservation Fund has supported since its inception. And we've been able to do that as the ABC thanks to the support of our members, your contributions through membership, and in many cases, your extra financial contributions as sponsorship of projects. So thank you very much for that. As Richard mentioned, to date, awards have totaled more than £293,000. And we've awarded, in the last year, 17 projects in 13 countries. So our income has been going up year by year, the income that we've been able to allocate to projects. We've given projects to 40 African countries and 4 European African overseas territories. I'll show a slide outlining those in a moment. And a lot of the work is done by our Conservation Committee. Richard alluded to them, but I would like to take the opportunity to thank them once again. Julius Arinatwe, who's the head of BirdLife for Africa in Nairobi, took over from Hazel Thompson, who was our speaker earlier this morning. And he often delegates to one of his species research colleagues called Kariuki Ndanganga. Phil Atkinson, who was, I believe, a chairman of the ABC in a previous incarnation. And then Lincoln Fishpool, who we heard speaking earlier today. Peter Jones, who's an academic at the University of Edinburgh. He's done a lot of research in Africa on birds. And Tim Dodman, who's well known for his work with the Wildfowl and not Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust. Wetlands International, thank you. I knew the word wetlands was in there somewhere. Okay, so these projects, so what I'm hoping to do today is, in this presentation, just give you a flavour of how your membership enables the Conservation Fund to support training, research and conservation projects in Africa. And if we just look at 2016, this shows the variety of projects that were funded just in the last year, the last calendar year, and the variety of countries. So I'd just like to point out some interesting projects there. Abyssinian owl on Mount Kenya, Bandingilo National Park survey. Hands up everyone who's been to Bandingilo National Park. That's in South Sudan. Very difficult place to access. And that was a South Sudanese team who did that. Sharp's Longclaw. Many of you will probably have seen Sharp's Longclaw in Kenya. An interesting project on steppe whimbrel, which is a subspecies of whimbrel believed to breed in central Kazakhstan, but the population was believed to be extinct until a few individuals turned up in South Africa. We managed to get a satellite tag on one of those, funded by ABC. Tighter, we've mentioned, tighter thrush. Then some more conservation-oriented projects, for example, reducing gill netting at Lake Chivero in Zimbabwe, and a biodiversity assessment of Lake Sonfon in Sierra Leone. And then, of course, some environmental education projects, as well as survey projects. So if we look at the breakdown over the period from 1996 to 2016, you can see those are the 40 countries and 4 territories. So the four territories, Azores and Madeira, belong to Portugal, Canary Islands to Spain, and Tristan da Cunha to the good old UK. What you can see from there is that some countries have received more grants than others. And obviously there's a language factor comes into play here. But Kenya, 57, Uganda, 21, South Africa, 17, and Nigeria, 10 grant recipients. However, Madagascar, which is really a French-speaking country, has also received 13, so it's one of the highest recipients. So it's not just purely down to language. In an ideal world, we would make our applications open in English, French, Portuguese, Spanish, and Arabic. But of course, it's very difficult to accomplish all that with a team of volunteers. And the general currency, the general language of ornithology does tend to be English. Most papers, peer-reviewed papers, are published in English. So we are hoping to get the website up and running in French at some point, but for the other African languages, it might take some time before that is possible. So hopefully you're all familiar with the African Bird Club website. Hands up who has visited the African Bird Club website? So everybody, okay, great. So that's the front page. Okay, how many people have visited the conservation section of the African Bird Club website? Slightly fewer. But I'd encourage you all to look there, because the projects that I'm going to highlight, many of them have their completed project reports available there, so you can look through to see what your money has helped to sponsor. So you can see outlined faintly awards, conservation applications, and past projects. So those are the 3 main sections of that website. And if you go into it, you look at the conservation funds, you get a full list of past projects and the guidelines of how to apply. So at the moment, for a conservation award, you can apply for £2,000. And are there any recipients of conservation awards in the audience here? Fish, yes. Who wasn't actually allowed to apply as Fish because he's on the conservation committee. He actually applied as Ben Phelan, or Ben Phelan applied. Yeah, okay. But, you know, if you are doing a conservation project in Africa and it counts as an expedition award, or you're doing it with local partners, you can apply. Okay, so this is a bit more detail of the conservation awards and the type of things that we encourage. So we probably now sponsor about 10 to 15 conservation awards per year. And these could include anything to do with the conservation of birds in Africa. Survey and research into African birds, of course, educational projects or training courses, the production of guides, field guides that is, to common birds of the country in local languages or to particular areas of the country, interpretation material for nature reserves. As the fund is small, normally we say that the applicants should be African nationals or resident in Africa, and we like to see that the the award forms a major part of the budget. So if people have a project that's worth £100,000, we feel that our £2,000 contribution is not critical to the success of that project. So we wouldn't countenance that. But if a project is £4,000 or £5,000, then £2,000 goes a long way to enabling that project to happen. So what I should say is Africa has 2,400 or so bird species, and 257 of which are threatened, and 1,247 important bird areas, now known as important bird and biodiversity areas. And they have also been redesignated as key biodiversity areas by IUCN. And we very much encourage conservation awards to focus on threatened species and IBAs, the most important and threatened birds and the most important and threatened places. That's also true for expedition awards, which have a slightly larger amount, up to £3,000. Obviously, they must take place in Africa, but they can be launched by people who live and reside outside Africa, such as European students, for example, or American students doing an expedition to an African country. So we have a set of deadlines. And then we do a review process. So we have 3 rounds of applications per year. The Conservation Committee reviews the applications and makes its recommendations to the Council. The Council, of course, and the Treasurer are in control of the money. They know how much money we have to allocate to conservation awards. And then I also try and contact sponsors who, very many individual sponsors who will list at the end, are able to give donations of £500 to a project or 1,000 projects. And one of our most generous sponsors is, of course, Tasso Leventis, who will sometimes fund whole projects himself. And when you go into the past projects section of the website, you will see a list of the projects like that. This is from 2015. And all the projects that are highlighted in capitals in green have past project reports there. So you can click on those links and look at a project a project report that ABC has funded. So another interactive question: how many people have actually done that? Looked at this section and looked at past projects? These numbers are starting to go down, aren't they? Everybody looks at the ABC website. Most people have looked at the conservation bit, but very few people have looked at past reports. Well, some of them are very interesting and usually contain colour photos of the birds that they have seen. So if you fancy browsing through, or if you want to do a search on a particular bird species, I would recommend looking through there. So now we come to a bit of an analysis of how conservation funds money has been spent over the past, 2006, 10 years. So as we said, it's about £293,000. And I broke the projects down into different kind of categories. So this is my own analysis, if you like. Species survey, which is looking for a particular species or maybe 2 or 3 species, such as a group of species. General survey, where people go out and actually look at all the avifauna in an area. Species research projects, which really target a particular species and aspects of its biology. Community conservation, which tries to engage communities in a conservation project. Education and awareness, which is more about enthusing school children, for example, or university students in conservation. Conference attendance, which is primarily supporting people to go to Pan-African Ornithological Congress, and then possibly a rather personal thing, species conservation, a couple of projects which I really feel made a real big difference to the conservation of a particular threatened species. What I'm going to do is run through a couple of examples of each of these types of projects. So now you'll get some bird pictures, finally. Or not. Okay, so this is the first one. As an example of a species survey project. So this was done in Zimbabwe by a chap called Roger Parry, who lives in Vic Falls. If I get this pointer to work. Vic Falls is there, very blurred. And this was an aerial survey. Now you might think, how can ABC possibly fund an aerial survey? Well, the answer was, it was in an ultralight motor glider. So basically sitting out there in a cockpit with a delta wing above you, And it was called a lambada ultralight, and I thought lambada was a type of dance. But they flew transect lines up and down here, surveying the whole of this area, which is just north of Hwangi National Park. I think Hwangi National Park is there. Obviously, the River Zambezi runs along there. So they did a survey for white-backed vulture, which is now a critically endangered species. And they used a low-flying aircraft to do that. That's the white-backed vulture. And they were able to identify 176 nest sites, because white-backed vultures actually nest usually in the top of acacia tortillers, which are flat-crowned acacia trees. So they're quite easy to identify from the air. So it was actually turned out to be a very important area for vulture nesting. And they were able to identify over half of the nests that they saw as definitely being white-backed vultures. They assumed that the other half were. They also found one marabou stork nest. So they've basically used that survey to identify this as a very good breeding area for white-backed vultures, the critically endangered species. Another example of a species survey or research project, species survey project, is the white-winged flufftail. It's a very cryptic small bird that inhabits wetlands. It's only known to occur in highland marshes near Addis Ababa in Ethiopia and about 4,000 kilometers to the south in South Africa. Places called like Middelpunt and Wakkerstroom and Franklin Marsh. And there's a lot of doubt as to whether or not these two populations are linked in any way or whether they're separate, whether in fact birds migrate between them. Nobody knows. Excuse me. So we funded, as a conservation fund, BirdLife South Africa to partner with the Ethiopian organisation to go up and collect or trap white-winged flufftails in Ethiopia and South Africa and collect isotope surveys from them. Isotope analysis, sorry, I should say, to understand the degree of interaction between the two populations and collecting blood and feather samples. So they actually managed to trap 7 flufftails in Ethiopia. And you can see that trapping a flufftail is quite a cause for celebration because they are so cryptic. So the results of that have been published. And you can, again, look on the website and get the full details if you'd like. So now the second type of project, general survey projects. So this is an example from Kenya, a place called Zombo Hill Forest. This was done by the NMK, National Museums of Kenya, and it was done as an expedition. And we do like to see that expeditions either occur in countries other than where you live or are a long way away from where you live. So we have had people who have tried to apply from Nairobi University for expeditions to Nairobi National Park. And we just say, you've got to go a bit further than that. But this area, the Zombo Hill Forest, is down on the coast, Kenyan coast, so a long way from Nairobi and National Museums of Kenya. And it's a small hill rising abruptly out of a low plain to 470 meters. So there's a lot of pressure from the local community around it, and it hadn't been surveyed well for avifauna. So NMK mounted an expedition, and they managed to record 118 species in December 2013, including martial eagle, which was vulnerable, and crowned eagle, which was endangered. And then these two birds here, the Peter's twin spot, bottom right, and the brown-hooded kingfisher up on the left. What they also found was a lot of images of snares up on the top right there. I'm pointing with my finger instead of with this. Yeah, and logging there. So they were able to, they also saw there was invasive species and community members were farming close to the forest. So they were able to make recommendations to the local Kenyan Wildlife Service and the Kenyan Forestry Service to try and help increase the protection of the area. Oops, wrong one. So apologies for the photograph here, it's a bit blurred, but this is an example of another general survey. ABC funded 3 surveys of water birds in Losa Bay, northwest Madagascar, by a Malagasy whose name I do have written down here, but I wouldn't begin to pronounce it. I can say his first name. His first name is Felix. There we go. but his second name is a string of consonants, and I wouldn't go there. So in total, they found 37 waterbird species belonging to 10 families, 4 species of which were threatened, including the Madagascar fish eagle, Humboldt's heron, Madagascar sacred ibis, and this bird, the Madagascar teal. So it was a significant finding to be able to identify the birds and the number of birds in that area. In addition, 30 forest bird species were inventoried. All of them were endemic or regionally endemic. And they also conducted interviews with local people to collect information on their use of natural resources and to try and understand the pressures on the natural resources through unsustainable use, fishing, and disturbance. Now we come to an example of a species research project that ABC funded. This was actually a Plori applied for funding to look at rosy bee-eaters, which are least concern, in Nigeria. And they wanted to do a breeding biology and population status survey. And what they did was went out to the Niger River and found a very, very large colony. So most of you will have seen bee-eaters nesting in vertical banks with holes going in horizontally. This bee-eater is very unusual, as it nests on pretty much flat sandbanks in the middle of the river and digs holes going down into the ground, basically into a horizontal surface. So they nest in huge colonies. They reckoned that there were 13,416 holes. They were very accurate. I don't know how they managed to count right the way down to that. So with about 27,000 birds. And obviously a colony like this, it's very open to predation. So Nile monitor lizards have a field day. But of course, there are only so many Nile monitor lizards around who can go into the nest. They can't possibly eat 13,400 chicks in the length of the breeding season. So that's their strategy, just to basically swamp any predators by appearing on these ephemeral islands. So many other observations were taken by the Plori team on diet, nest hole structure, and density. So that was a very focused species survey, species research project. Okay. Second example of a species research project that ABC funded was on this beautiful bird, the Ethiopian bush crow, which is an endangered species, and also it's it co-occurs with a bird called the white-tailed swallow, which is classified as vulnerable, both in Ethiopia. And Andrew Bladen, who was a Cambridge University student at the time doing a PhD, was awarded an expedition award to go and look at these. They have a very restricted range within the Yabelo Wildlife Sanctuary in Ethiopia. And it wasn't at all apparent why they were restricted to this strange small area of acacia open woodland. And it turned out, these are called the Borana rangelands, actually. The Borana tribe graze cattle here, which is why the substrate is quite open there and grazed. And what they did was use temperature loggers, which if you can see, there's one lodged there. That is the edge of a temperature logger, concealed in tree holes across the region, recording hourly temperature. And they used those to look at the temperature regimes which correlated, it turns out, with bush crow and with Ethiopian swallow distribution. So again, the full details of that research project are available on the website. So if anyone feels that I am not fully explaining what happened, go and look on the website at the full report. So now an example of a community conservation project funded by the ABC. So this is a training of guards and guides in Senegal in a park called Parc National Niokolo Koba, NK. It's a World Heritage Site, and in 2007 it was listed as a World Heritage Site in danger. So it's a very important site. And a cooperative of guides applied for funding in order to get training in ornithological techniques and identification. So a course was run for 4 days for about 13 people in identification of water birds, techniques for monitoring birds, concepts of migration, data management. And the idea was that these guides will be trained up so that they can guide tourists, earn an income, and help contribute to the monitoring of the park's population of birds. Second example of a community conservation project comes from Kenya. So this is a rather, again, blurred photograph of the Mukurweini valleys on the slopes of Mount Kenya. And it's an IBA which is host to Heinz babbler, which is a vulnerable species, an endangered species. And there you have a picture of Heinz babbler with a whole lot of school children holding up a banner. So the conservation project was awarded to Gabriel Ngali of the Wildlife Clubs of Kenya. So he was able to animate the site support group that already existed and help enthuse about 1,500 teachers and 8,500 kids as to the importance of Heinz babbler and the need to protect it and conserve its habitat. I can't resist also mentioning that they formed a Heinz babbler volleyball tournament and organised by Nature Kenya's site support group. So another type of project that ABC has sponsored is education and awareness projects. So in Malawi, we funded a wildlife club coordinator who was working with the Wildlife and Environment Society of Malawi, WESM, and this coordinator was called Johnson Namauti. There he is with his motorbike, and we actually able to fund him for about 9 months of work, to work with local school children in the Folombe district, which is apparently situated next to the Ramsar site, which is associated with Lake Chilwa. So it's a very important area for birds. And they created a bird activity book, which is wonderful. And again, it's available on the website in the past project section. I thought it was a very, very impressive piece of work. Mainly in black and white because of the needs for reducing the cost of photocopying. But it told children all about the different types of bills and beaks that birds have and what kind of diet that implies they have. And some interesting facts about the fastest birds, the smallest birds, and the biggest birds. And something I particularly like, because I'm a bit of a crossword fan, a little crossword puzzle for kids to do. So they managed to produce hundreds of these books at very low prices and distribute them to schools over a period of, as I say, of 9 months. So it's a very effective project. Another example of education and awareness. This is a citizen science and bird conservation group in Nigeria. This was an award to Olubunmi Jigedi of the NCF, Nigerian Conservation Fund. And it's the forerunner of the Ibadan Bird Club. So it was basically setting up a group of students at a university to become interested in birds and develop a bird watching club. There was also a 3-day training workshop attended by 40 people, which included facilitators and staff of local partners. All of those were represented at the workshop. And those included staff of the Department of Wildlife and Ecotourism, University of Ibadan, and the International Institute for Tropical Agriculture. So it was training students and local practitioners in bird identification. I said that we also funded a conference attendance for POC attendees, and those are some of the ones that we've funded. Many of you will probably have come across Diana Nalwanga, who used to work for Nature Uganda in Uganda, and Dominic Kimani, who has also received an award for work on the Sharp's longclaw in Kenya. Finally, the last type of project, species conservation project, I'm calling these. There's a little bit of a semantic difference, but these are 2 projects that I think really made a difference to the conservation of threatened species. So this one is the Zambian barbet, Libius chaplini. So named after a chap called Chaplin, if you can say that, a chap called Chaplin. And the extensive survey revealed that it's Zambia's only endemic bird. It's confined just to Zambia. And the survey came up with a lot of different conservation recommendations. I should say it was done by Lisanne Roxburgh, who now I think works in South Africa. But what they managed to do was get the common name changed from Chaplin's barbet to Zambian barbet, which I think will have great conservation implications to it, because this was classified as least concern, or sorry, near threatened. It's been upgraded to vulnerable, but now it is actually named the Zambian barbet. We very much hope that that will provide a stimulus to the Zambian government to take conservation measures for it, rather than it being named after a former colonial bird watcher. Of course, the scientific name still remains. So Chaplin himself is still remembered in the scientific name of the barbet, but the common name, Zambian barbet, should achieve conservation gains. So, last species conservation project I'll mention is on Lillian's or Nyasa lovebird, which is near threatened in Malawi. And this was done by Tibongi Mzumara, who is now married, and I've forgotten what her name's changed to, but I'm happy to report that Tibongi has maintained her interest in birds and is a council member of the African Bird Club. So this study aimed to look at the current status of Lillian's lovebird in Liwonde National Park in Malawi, and to investigate the hunting activities of the communities around the park. And one of the problems was that lovebirds were being found poisoned at water holes. Local hunters were poisoning small water holes, really to hunt game animals, but the Lillian's lovebirds were being impacted as well. So the communities around the reserve were sensitized about the status of the bird and agreed to avoid indiscriminate poisoning. So it was a definite conservation gain. Now, the last bit, so that's the end of the different types of conservation projects that the Conservation Fund has definitely deliberately funded. I'm just going to mention, I know Richard's already mentioned it, he's stolen some of my thunder here, about the Taita Hills, Kenya, Msiduni Forest. Now, I'm not sure if you actually showed a photograph of the patch that the ABC has secured the lease on. So this is actually that patch in question. So as you can see, it's 6 hectares of lovely forest. Taita Hills is full of endemic plants and endemic insects and reptiles. Plus, I have a better photograph than Richard showed of the Taita Opalis. And we're very pleased that, sorry, it was 7.5 hectares of this forest fragment has been brought under management by ABC conservation funds. And under the 25-year lease, there are 2 birds there, the Taita Opalis, which is critically endangered, and the Taita thrush. So we're hoping that that will increase forest connectivity at a priority site for addressing fragmentation within the Taita Hills. So, to recap, we're getting better. We're getting better at fundraising money from members and from donors. And as you can see, our grant income is going up. So we have in total given £293,000 to 235 grants since the club began, which is brilliant. So thank you all very much for your contributions. And of course to individual project sponsors over the last few years. I can see there are other people in the room here who have been sponsors in the past. I'm sorry if you're not mentioned up there, but thank you all very much for your contributions. Thanks especially also for loan of slides. Several people lent me slides. And just to conclude, that the ABC Conservation Awards have helped support survey, research and conservation of threatened species and IBAs. And all of us here in this room want to stop other African bird species going the way of the dodo. which you can see up there. Although from this photo, it does look like they had a hell of a party. Thank you very much.